The Adelaide Crows. For 2 years in the mid-2000s, they didn't just compete, they suffocated the AFL. They played like an impenetrable machine, smashing records in the process, dispatching opponents as if they were nothing. Their rise had been extremely sudden. A new coach and new game plan seemingly had them rise overnight from bottom four consideration into premiership contention. But there was one other side in the competition who knew exactly how to short-circuit this machine. A side that would go on to break the Crows 2 seasons in a row in the second last week. Plenty of clubs before and since have stumbled at the penultimate hurdle. Essendon in 99, Port Adelaide in 2003, Richmond in 2018. But the Crows, they lived it twice, with no premiership triumphs on either side to soften the blow. It didn't take long for the Adelaide Football Club to run into premiership success. In 1997, just 7 seasons into their existence, they won their first. Then they won another, 2 in a row, a rare feat which they'd done in almost record time. After going back-to-back, the Crows regressed, still making finals here and there, but never re-emerging as a true flag threat. The list remained filled to the brim with premiership stars, but they were ageing. And following a poor 99 season, Malcolm Blight, the man who'd led them to their success, stepped down as coach, eventually being replaced by Gary Ayres. Over the next few years, the Crows steadied. The club played finals 3 seasons back-to-back from 2001 to 03, peaking in 02 with a 4th place regular season finish and preliminary final loss to the Pies at the MCG. But for Gary Ayres, pressure was mounting. By the end of 2003, yes, his team had just made their 3rd consecutive final series, but this was still a relatively experienced side, built upon some of the competition's heavyweights, which included the likes of Rashuto, who had just come off a Brownlow winning season. For fans, the feeling was that the club under Ayres was resting on its laurels, not making the most of its on-field assets to take advantage of a window of opportunity which, because of a perceived lack of emerging young talent, was close to slamming shut. And so, when the team's performance nosedived in 2004, the wheels fell off completely. A crushing 75-point opening round loss at home to the Kangaroos set the tone. Injuries to star midfielder Simon Goodwin and key defender Ben Hart hardly helped the cause. And by mid-season, the club found themselves only a couple percentage points away from breaching the bottom 4. A round 13 victory over the struggling Bulldogs at Amy proved too little too late for Ayres to keep his position. The writing was on the wall. He was sacked, replaced by one of his assistants, Neil Craig. Craig's appointment as full-time coach in the lead-up to 2005 was considered underwhelming by media and fans alike. He'd originally been considered little more than an interim stopgap, and whilst the Crows' performance in pure win-loss terms improved slightly during his initial tenure, a 141-point drubbing to the Lions, amongst some other poor results, had hardly made him a fan favourite. Craig's recent history as one of Ayres' assistants also worked against him in the eyes and the ears of the court of public opinion. The likes of Terry Wallace and Rodney Eade, both names that carried respect and gravitas as known head coaching quantities, were floated, but never seriously considered by the Crows board, feeding the perception that Craig had essentially been pre-selected by the club's hierarchy even before Ayres' dismissal. And truth be told, there might have been some sound reason for that pre-selection, because Craig's contributions at the Crows already ran deep. Originally appointed as the club's fitness advisor in 1997, he was considered a key part of Adelaide's back-to-back late 90s premierships, and has since been credited with popularising some now common practices in the AFL high-performance space, such as assigning his players hardest training sessions for the mid-season, which peaked their fitness just in time for finals. Ultimately, the Crows players were trained hard and programmed for endurance, which worked perfectly in tandem with head coach Malcolm Blight's vision of up-tempo, high-pressure football, to such an extent in fact that, whilst Adelaide hadn't come close to topping the ladder in either flag year, their fresh legs carried them through finals and seemed to always have them coasting over the top of sides late in matches. The most famous example coming in the 97 prelim against the Dogs, in which they'd erased a 25-point deficit well into the last quarter to win by 2, and reach the grand final. But as much as Craig's fitness legacy was respected, he remained an unproven head coach at AFL level. By 2005, expectations were low. The Crows list was seen as past its best, many believing their window had slammed shut. What followed was a genuine shock. Adelaide won 17 games, dominated large stretches of the season, and finished top of the ladder for the first time in club history. The season began without much spark. A flat home loss to the Eagles and a narrow win over a poorly rated Collingwood did little to raise expectations. But the side's round 3 drubbing of reigning Premier Port Adelaide in the season's first showdown provided the first glimpses to what Craig's side were capable of. Consistency, though, was harder to come by. Impressive wins were interlaced with poor defeats, and by round 8, a pair of dour losses, including an especially meek 1-goal first half against a Lions side that had become a shell of their three-peat self, had fans and media expressing frustration toward what appeared to be purely timid and conservative football, clearly lacking the tempo, coordinated team defence and purposeful and precise counter-attacks that would later come as the side's trademark. But then everything started to click. Adelaide became a machine. The club lost just one more game the rest of the season, placing first and qualifying for a crucial double chance at Amy Stadium. The rise came off the back of a very regimented, systematic style of football that eventually earned the side their nickname, the Crowbots. Their defensive game differed from traditional one-on-one defense. Instead, they operated as a unit across the ground in what Craig himself years later reflected on as being a prototypical example of a zone defence. Their superior fitness allowed the midfield to cover the ground generously, strangling the opposition's attacking movement, suffocating their opposition's quality of entrance inside 50, and forcing turnover after turnover, giving defenders the access and cover to mop up and rebound. With the ball in hand, they prioritised patience over chaos. They'd probe uncontested targets, working their way forward with method and precision, their foot skills and overlapping run allowing them to maintain some semblance of speed and direction whilst doing so. And though the side lacked a dominant full forward such as Barry Hall at Sydney, they always managed to pepper their forward 50 with enough frequency and penetration to kick winning scores. Superstars Rashuto and Goodwin often chipped in with goals from the midfield, in Rashuto's case sometimes as a makeshift full forward, and Andrew McLeod and Graham Johncock were licensed to run with some dash and dare from half back, providing an offensive weapon for faster counterattacks. Ultimately though, their game was built on suffocation, driven by a hunger to work two ways and the fitness level to achieve it. And admittedly, it always helps to have a traditional one-on-one defender like Ben Rutten improve out of nowhere and make a habit of monstering every full forward that the team faces that season. Their improvement across the 2005 season had been pretty insane. Their 2 matches against the Bulldogs at the bookends illustrates this perfectly. In round 5, Adelaide conceded 140 points to the Dogs, including 9 goals in a third quarter that had them playing footy about as accountable as a witch's hat. The return match between the two sides at Amy just 11 weeks later couldn't have played out more differently. The Crows conceded just a quarter of their round 5 concession, 35 points. The club closed their home and away campaign having conceded an average of just 69 points a match. This is impressive enough in modern terms, but back in the 2000s, following some extremely high-scoring decades, it was doubly so, coming as the lowest average conceded in 37 years. By the time finals rolled around, Adelaide looked unstoppable. But one team would prove their kryptonite, a team that would prove to get the best of them in the most crucial of matches, in not just 2005, but 06 too. And so, say hello to the Crowbots' worst nightmare, the West Coast Eagles. Like the Crows, the Eagles had improved massively. They weren't rising from as far back, having already played finals in 2004, but in 2005, they exploded. Where Adelaide thrived on structure and suffocation, West Coast dazzled with pace and polish. Their midfield, Judd Cousins-Kerr, tore through the corridor, delivering precision kicks to their forwards, but also kicking goals themselves. It was fast, it was flashy, and it had the Eagles firmly top of the ladder, right up until the last round of the season when they were usurped by the Crows. The Crows went on to face St Kilda in a home qualifying final, but having lost Rashuto through suspension in the week previous, they lost a grinding contest that snapped their 10-game winning streak. Suddenly, instead of cruising, Adelaide were forced into a showdown semi-final against Port Adelaide, and more importantly, set on a collision course with West Coast at Subiaco. Adelaide crushed Port in the semi, but their preliminary final at Subi was a much tougher proposition. The first half was predictably tight and physical, but the Eagles upped the ante in the third quarter. In just 10 minutes they piled on 5 goals. Adelaide couldn't even move the ball past halfway. Warapunda, Chicken Judd in particular, ran riot, goals coming cheap as candy in a frenetic display that Adelaide couldn't suffocate. The Crows rallied late, but it was too little, too late. Their season ended in Perth. Despite this, the season had been an incredible success. Optimism carried into 2006 with Adelaide backing in essentially the same squad that had surged the year prior. The club opened their season with an exhibition in tempo footy against the Magpies. Having surrendered 4 quick goals late into the third quarter, the Crows found themselves staring down the barrel of a defeat to a young Pies outfit threatening to run over the top. Players didn't panic though, they instead took control. They slowed the contest to a crawl, chipping the ball to and fro for what seemed like more than 10 minutes, completely dissolving Collingwood's momentum and eventually identifying forward targets who could slowly wrestle back the lead by the 3/4 time break. Having starved their opposition of all momentum, they went on to roll the Pies in the last quarter for what in the end was a comfortable victory. Craig was full of praise afterwards, highlighting how his players had calmly shifted into tempo football without direction from the coaches, evidence of their growing confidence in the system. Whilst the win itself had come against a young, raw Magpies outfit, the way the Crows managed the game spoke volumes. It signalled not just continuity from 2005, but an increasing ability to manage momentum in-game. By now, Neil Craig had a reputation as something of an AFL mad scientist, investing in some unorthodox ways to prepare his team for matches, as a result having his Crows playing what some had called 22nd century football. Journalists at the time reported on some of the more intricate details. Placing small phones inside the players' GPS vests during training sessions was one of the more novel, allowing Craig to maintain direct communication with his players at all times for real-time instruction and feedback. Everything was built on science and data. Training loads and running distances were monitored closely, so that by game day, Craig and his assistants knew precisely when their players needed rotating. Even the smallest details weren't overlooked. On flights to Sydney and Brisbane, humidifiers were used to help the group acclimate to the conditions ahead of time. The man himself spoke philosophically on what he believed good coaching to be in an appearance on the Great Coaches Leadership and Life podcast just a few years ago.
And so your best coaches are not risk adverse. They understand that if you don't take risks, you end up being an imitator. So you imitate people, whereas your best coaches want to be innovators. There's something special about being the first to do things. I reckon that's great, because by the time someone imitates what you're doing, like you're doing the next thing on top of it.
But in round 8, the innovator came up against the game's best imitator, Richmond coach Terry Wallace. The Tigers, fresh off a 120-point humiliation at the hands of Sydney, stunned the football world, pinching a 3-point win in one of the AFL's greatest upsets. The Tigers famously made the game less about football and entirely about tempo. Chipping the ball across half-back, not for a 10-minute period, no, but for essentially an entire match, refusing to let the Crows' defensive zone dictate play. The ploy was radical. Richmond racked up the most marks ever recorded in a VFL-AFL match, forced Adelaide to play man-on-man, and in doing so denied them the chance to feast on the turnovers and rebounds that had become their weapon of choice. For the Crows, the defeat was more curiosity than catastrophe. They bounced back with a vengeance, piling on huge scores in the weeks that followed, including a club record 30 goals against Essendon in round 10. By the end of round 16, they sat proudly on top of the ladder with just 2 losses and a percentage bordering on historic. To put it simply, the Crows were conceding minute scores, smashing even the miserly defensive record they set just the year prior, all whilst regularly piling on triple-digit scores of their own. They looked untouchable. Midfielder Tyson Edwards reflected on the group's sky-high confidence during his appearance on Amato's 5th quarter.
We knew if we got 2 or 3 goals up against a team, they weren't going to beat us just because of our style. And that's against anyone, and that's a really good feeling to have, and it's it's sort of more annoying that, we didn't get a chance to put that out on the big stage.
But this impressive form was a week away from grinding to a halt. Round 17 delivered a reality check as brutal as it was unexpected. An 82-point loss to, guess who? The West Coast Eagles. The result was a complete shock. Whilst the Eagles clearly had the wood over the Crows, having bested them in 3 of their previous 4 meetings, this wasn't a besting, it was a beatdown. The Eagles' stars got off the chain. The Crows had no answers. Cousins, Kerr and Judd recorded an absurd 93 possessions, 7 goals and 25 clearances between them. Michael Braun had 41 touches and 5 clearances. Adelaide, who hadn't allowed any opponent to crack 100 points all season, conceded 26 goals and 165 points in this game. For a side that had seemed almost impenetrable, it was now becoming obvious that the Eagles had these Crows in their pockets. And unlike the game against Richmond, this one would prove not to be an aberration. Over the final 5 weeks of the regular season, the Crows managed just 2 more wins, dropping to second spot, conceding an average of 89 points in the process, and looking unconvincing even when victorious. They often looked out of ideas. Tempo footy, for example, which had been a weapon for them earlier in the season, looked completely ineffective now. In fact, in their round 20 match against the Dogs, it almost appeared as though the ball was being put on a platter for a frenetic Dog side who, unfazed by the slowed play, put on 5 goals late in the third quarter to steal an unlikely lead. Wingman Brett Burton opened up on the toll of Crowbot football during his Conversations with Corndy podcast appearance a few years ago.
That we were able to achieve a high level of performance in those 05 and 06 years off the back of training hard. But we also felt like we were pushing too hard. And I remember coming off of training sessions where you were that fatigued, and sometimes you'd be able to go out and perform on the weekend, and other times you felt a bit sluggish. And we probably just overstretched during those times, and unfortunately weren't able to make the most of our opportunities.
Neil Craig, whose training philosophies had contributed so much success to the Malcolm Blight-led 90s side and which had transformed this mid-2000s outfit, now found himself overseeing a fatigued, increasingly injury-hit group of players who'd perhaps been pushed too hard in the pursuit of perfection. Key players, McLeod, Johncock, Henschel and Burton began missing weeks, and Craig himself may have been wilting. He reflected on a period of time earlier in the 2006 season in the podcast In the Arena.
Look, I remember Stephen Trigg coming into my office one day. I think we'd won about 4 or 5 games in a row and sitting second or on top of the table. And he came in and he said, how are you going? I said, no, going well. He said, no, I don't think you are. Just your body language, the way you spoke to the head trainer the other day is not. He said, I reckon you're a bit tired. And then he sort of said, how dare you get tired? How dare you get tired in this role?
You're not allowed to get tired.
You're not the coach that we employed. And you need to be the coach. That's what I call care.
The side regrouped to finals, ending a rampaging Dockers on a 9-game winning streak at a windswept Amy Stadium. But a last-minute Swans goal at Subiaco in the second qualifying final put the Crows on a collision course once again with the side they'd wanted to face least. By now, it was no secret. The Eagles had the wood over Adelaide. They knew how to play the Crows. Just look at the numbers. In 2006, West Coast had the equal highest handball to kick ratio in the league. Their style revolved around quick hands and constant movement. Ruckman Cox, directing traffic at stoppages, would time after time give first use to one of the most devastating midfields the game had ever seen, who played with speed, skill and fluidity, chaining handballs from the stoppage, a sleight of hands that was almost impossible to contain. And so it came as a surprise when the Crows got off to such a good start in the 2006 preliminary final. Adelaide flipped the script, dragging the contest onto their terms. By halftime, they led by 4 goals, suffocating West Coast's spread and holding them to just 2 majors. The Crowbots, it seems, were back to their defensive best. But then the game turned. Crows ruckman Rhett Biglands went down injured, giving Dean Cox free rein at the stoppages. From there, the Eagles midfield took control. Cousins, in particular, was unstoppable, at times having West Coast look like the Harlem Globetrotters, handballing their way through the middle with pace and precision, overwhelming Adelaide's midfield and piling on the goals. The Crows kept fighting, but eventually succumbed to a heartbreaking 10-point loss. Brett Burton had this to say about Cousins' second half performance.
I remember Cousins just having a phenomenal second half. We had Nathan Famberlo tagging him, and Nathan was one of their best runners and certainly our best taggers in the side, and he said afterwards he just could not keep up with him.
It was a devastating result. To fall short in back-to-back preliminary finals against the same opponent was a bitter pill for Adelaide to swallow. What stung even more though were the what-ifs. The Crows, they may have struggled against West Coast, but against Sydney, the other heavyweights of the mid-2000s, they had the wood. Across 2005 and 06, Adelaide beat the Swans in every one of their meetings, 3 from 3 across the home and away seasons. Clubs have gone down in prelim heartbreakers before and since, but this Adelaide side are a rare example of a team who would have gone into both grand finals as clear favourites, had only they been able to overcome their nemesis. By 2007, the Crowbots had faded. Adelaide opened the year with a sobering 31-point home loss to a side they'd smashed by 138 at the same grounds less than a year earlier. They ended up winning enough games to squeeze into the 8s, but were eliminated in the first week of finals. The club would remain a steady September presence for the next couple of years, but never recaptured the heights of 05 and 06. Their core stars were ageing and retiring, injuries chipped away at continuity, and perhaps most importantly, the game itself had changed. Geelong dominated the competition by adapting West Coast's handball-happy surging run through the midfield, and the rest of the competition followed. Ultimately, Neil Craig's Crows have gone down as a side that missed a golden opportunity to win a flag in the mid-2000s, a side which was probably the strongest across those 2 seasons, but who couldn't replicate their regular season form in the most crucial of matches. In the years following their preliminary final losses, Crowbot's nickname became more a mocking term than an endearing one. The rigid system, once praised as impenetrable, was recast as inflexible. The emphasis on discipline and conditioning reframed as overbearing. The story of the Crowbots has too often been told through this critical lens, as though they were doomed by their own methods rather than undone by the slimmest of margins. And whilst it's true that mistakes were made, Craig would be the first to admit he'd shown some inflexibility at crucial times. The truth is that one less free kick here or one less suspension there could have had these Crows achieving the ultimate. As they say though, history tends to look much more kindly on the winners, even if the margins are razor thin.